In February 2024, Russian forces and the Malian allies seized control of an artisanal gold mine in northern Mali called Intahaka. Within months, that gold was flowing through Dubai's markets, refined into standard bars with fresh certificates converted into the hard currency Moscow desperately needs. Since 2022, an estimated $2.5 billion in African gold has flowed through this pipeline into Russian coffers. These are not loans or trade deals. This is blood gold, extracted at gunpoint from some of the world's poorest communities. At a time when Russia's foreign reserves are frozen and the banks are cut off from SWIFT, these billions in hard currency keep the Iranian drones coming, pay for North Korean shells, and fund the sanctions of Asian networks that sustain the war. Russia's proposition to African dictators is brutally simple. We'll keep you in power, you give us your gold. No democracy lectures, no governance requirements, no transparency demands, just mercenaries for minerals. When rebels are 60 kilometers from your capital, Wagner troops who'll actually fight look more attractive than Western governance advisors who'll write reports. Whether they can actually deliver is questionable, but Moscow has figured out that desperate dictators make reliable suppliers of resources. What Russia has built across Africa is a 21st century protection racket dressed up in anti-Western rhetoric. They're not liberating anyone. They're arming hunters, protecting dictators, and extracting resources in exchange. The system works perfectly for anyone with a gun. Russian generals get hard currency for their war, African strongmen get regime protection, Middle Eastern money launderers get their cut. The only ones who lose out? Ordinary Africans. Now, to understand how we got here, we have to go back to the Soviet era. For decades, Moscow positioned itself as Africa's anti-colonial champion. Never mind that it was simultaneously crushing rebellions in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, just ignore that. The Soviets backed anyone who opposed the West. Marxist rebels in Angola, military dictators in Ethiopia, liberation movements across the continent. They shipped weapons, sent advisors, built Patrice Lumumba University to train future African elites. By the 1980s, there were Cuban troops in Angola, Soviet advisors in Mozambique, and MiG fighters from Libya to Ethiopia. The cost was astronomical, but Moscow was playing a real-life game of Risk against Washington, one in which the whole planet was the board. Then 1991 hit, and the Soviet project collapsed. Russia didn't gradually withdraw from Africa, it vanished. Embassies closed, military advisors disappeared, aid programs ended overnight. The new Russian Federation was fighting for economic survival, with inflation hitting 2,500% in 1992. Africa wasn't even an afterthought. For the entire 1990s, Russian presence on the continent consisted of desperate fire sales of old Soviet weapons stockpiles and the occasional diplomat trying to collect on old debts. The networks built over decades atrophied. The grand ideological project was dead. Putin began to change that, slowly but surely, in the 2000s, as Russia began stabilizing its economy, especially thanks to oil surging from $10 a barrel in 1998 to over $100 a decade later, the country began to find its footing and started flexing its muscles on the global stage. By 2008's invasion of Georgia, the world was clearly dealing with a very different Russia, one with money, confidence, and a willingness to use force to crush anyone who opposed it. With this newfound confidence, Moscow began deploying a different kind of weapon through economic channels. Russia started writing off old Soviet-era debts of $20 billion worth by the early 2010s. Now look, Putin's known for many things, but charitable donations, not exactly one of them. Each write-off came with strings attached that were very much in Moscow's interests. Mining concessions, new arms deals, energy projects, you name it. In 2009, Dmitry Medvedev toured Egypt, Nigeria, Namibia, and Angola with a delegation of businessmen talking about nuclear power and mining rights. It wasn't until the 2014 annexation of Crimea, though, that Russia began to get deeply involved in Africa. Now, let's be clear, it wasn't as if the Kremlin magically rediscovered the continent one day. Western sanctions, even the weak and woeful ones trotted out in 2014, hit Russia's economy harder than Putin had envisioned. The ruble lost half its value, capital outflows reached $150 billion in 2014 alone, and GDP contracted sharply. The Kremlin needed new sources of hard currency, new markets for its weapons, and diplomatic allies who wouldn't raise complaints about its territorial ambitions. From this perspective, Africa had never looked so good. Here were 54 potential UN votes, vast mineral wealth, governments that needed military equipment and little concern for their annexation of Crimea. As the debt write-offs really picked up steam, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov became something of a regional rock star, showing up in Egypt one day, Ethiopia the next, making promises that Moscow wouldn't have previously been able to afford, but now lacked alternatives to. So, Russia began pushing military cooperation agreements across the continent. Sudan, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, offering to maintain Soviet-era equipment that they naturally had the most experience and supplies for. They also started bidding aggressively on nuclear projects through Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear corporation. Egypt signed up for a 4.8 gigawatt plant at Dabar worth $30 billion. Nigeria began negotiations for up to 4 reactors. Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Ghana all signed cooperation agreements. These were decades-long relationships that would lock African countries into Russian technology, Russian fuel, and Russian maintenance. But the real breakthrough, that came in 2017, when the country got official exemption from the UN to send weapons and military instructors to the Central African Republic at a time in the midst of a sectarian meltdown. But rather than a stabilization force, Russia sent in one of the most destabilizing forces so far seen on a modern battlefield, the Wagner Group. Officially there as instructors, Wagner had soon secured mining concessions and was even providing presidential security. It was in the CAR that Moscow's model was proven: security for resources, no questions asked. By 2019, Russia was ready to formalize this relationship. The Russia-Africa Summit in Sochi drew 43 African heads of state, a stunning turnout for a country that had been absent from the continent just 2 decades earlier. Over the course of 2 days, Putin signed deals worth $12.5 billion and initiated another 92 cooperation agreements. The scope was staggering. Energy and arms agreements for Egypt and Nigeria, railway modernization in Angola, platinum mining in Zimbabwe, oil exploration in Equatorial Guinea. The appeal for these countries varied, but was often genuine. For stable states like Egypt or Algeria, Russia offered an alternative to Western dependence: nuclear energy plans, arms deals, and trade agreements without preconditions on democratic reforms. But for other African countries, the appeal ran much deeper than just finding alternative trading partners. These leaders were dealing with frustrations about Western support becoming increasingly contentious domestically, with some seeing it as a form of imperialism. The French relationship with West Africa had become particularly strained by this point. 14 countries to this day still use the CFA franc, a sort of offshoot of Paris's pre-euro currency provided to assist with monetary stability, which left a sense of fiscal powerlessness. French companies had secured contracts back in the 60s that gave control over major ports, oil fields, and infrastructure. When the French military launched Operation Barkhane to fight terrorism in the Sahel, it was supposed to bring stability. Instead, after a decade and billions spent, the security situation was worse than when they started, yet French uranium mining in Niger had never slowed down. The optics weren't exactly favorable. French troops protecting uranium mines while the jihadist threat they were supposed to be there to fight kept expanding. Russia didn't have to work particularly hard to exploit this, they just had to point out that after so many years, perhaps it was time to give something else a try. By 2022, Russia had converted these grievances into concrete opportunities. Wagner, already operating in the Central African Republic, expanded into Mali as French forces pulled back. Deals were struck with Sudan for access to gold mines. Moscow was essentially running a satellite security service business with payment in commodities rather than cash. For African governments that took the deal, it solved the immediate problems, even if it created long-term dependencies. This arrangement might have remained a profitable side business for Russia if all had gone according to plan. Some arms deals here, mining deals there. But in February 2022, everything changed. Putin's would-be 3-day special military operation against Ukraine turned into the largest European war since 1945, and the resulting Western sanctions froze $300 billion in Russian reserves and locked them out of the global financial system. Suddenly, those African gold miners weren't a nice-to-have revenue stream, they were one of the few reliable sources of hard currency left. The extraction machine that had been running at partial capacity was about to go into overdrive. As Western sanctions began to bite in early 2022, the Kremlin's African racket expanded with all the speed and recklessness of an AI startup racing to build Skynet. Wagner had been operating across Africa since 2017, but as the realization sank in that Ukraine wasn't going to be anywhere near a 3-day operation, gold in particular went from a profitable sideline to an essential component of Russia's war machine. What had been tested and proven in CAR became the template for systematic extraction across the continent. At their peak, Wagner had over 5,000 fighters across Africa, from Mali to Sudan to General Haftar's Liberia. Not only that, they were running an entire business empire. Overall, it's estimated that the group generated $2.5 billion for the Russian state just from their African operations. The genius of the Wagner model was its simplicity. A government that was facing a crisis, whether from advancing rebels, coup threats, a vacuum left from departing troops from another country, that government needed support, and fast. Wagner offered a package deal. Fighters, weapons, training. Payment came not in cash, which these governments rarely had, but in mining concessions and resource rights. This system didn't stand the test of time, though, given Prigozhin's bizarre mutiny. Now, look, we've covered this extensively on our sister channel, Warfronts, but the short version is that in June 2023, Wagner columns marched on Moscow while much of the Russian army was outside of the country, posing a genuine threat to Putin's rule, who called it treason. It stopped, out of the blue, with Prigozhin's negotiated exile to Belarus, and then received its coda when he conveniently died in a plane crash just months later. Convenient. Yet for all Prigozhin may now have been showing off his penile implants in hell, his business model was too valuable to simply abandon. Instead, Moscow absorbed Wagner's African operations into the Ministry of Defense, rebranding them as Africa Corps. This was more than a new coat of paint. After the group's would-be march on Moscow, Russia wanted to bring the group under much tighter control. Unsurprisingly, many fighters didn't want to join the new organization, and the ones who did weren't quite the same caliber. Recent reports from Mali suggest that the junta wasn't thrilled with the quality drop. This transition, nevertheless, happened remarkably quickly. In the Central African Republic, President Touadéra requested to keep some of his Wagner bodyguards, and they stayed, but they were just under new management. In Mali, Wagner officially left, while Africa Corps arrived. Similar setup, different patches. The extraction infrastructure remained intact, the gold kept flowing in the fields, the bodies kept burning, and you better believe the war machine kept turning. And this infrastructure remains in place today. Security forces to protect extraction sites, state companies to handle the contracts, diplomatic cover to legitimize it all. From Wagner's chaotic freelancing to Africa Corps' systematic exploitation, from one-off deals to integrated state policy, Russia has built a machine designed to convert African resources into hard currency. The question isn't whether the system works, it does. The question is how exactly African gold and diamonds become Iranian drones and North Korean shells. Where that money leads is another story entirely. Okay, so we can trace specific resource flows from African extraction sites through laundering networks into Russia's war chest. The documentation exists in UN investigations, treasury sanctions, satellite imagery showing mining expansions during the war. The companies are identified, the routes mapped, the amounts calculated. What emerges is a systematic pipeline that converts African minerals into hard currency for Russian military operations. Mali provides the clearest example of how this extraction works. The Malian junta pays Russian forces approximately $10 to $11 million monthly for military support. As cash tightens, Mali has deepened its gold sector ties with Russia, from the 2024 seizure of the Intahaka artisanal gold mine to a Russia-backed state refinery launched in 2025. Western mining companies are getting systematically pushed out. Barrick Gold had to suspend operations in January 2025 after the government seized 3 tons of their gold. With Mali's gold exports running $5 to $6 billion annually, Moscow is positioned to capture a growing share of that value. The Central African Republic takes this even further. The Natasima gold mine is CAR's only industrial-scale operation controlled by Midas Resources, a Wagner-linked company that's now under US sanctions. According to Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, Midas was exempt from all payments to the CAR government. They found no recorded public revenue from the operation. They're extracting somewhere in the vicinity of $500 million of gold annually from one of the world's poorest countries, with exemptions that effectively zero out government revenue. Satellite imagery shows their processing facilities expanded significantly during 2022 and 2023, right as the Ukraine war intensified. US sanctions and advisories identified Wagner-linked CAR gold networks routing through the UAE to generate hard currency. Sudan's numbers, they're even more staggering. One analysis estimated that 32.7 tons of gold worth approximately $1.9 billion went unaccounted for in the country during 2021 alone, before the Ukraine invasion even took place. The main operators in the country are Moreau Gold and M-Invest, both Wagner fronts that are now sanctioned by the United States and others. Prior to 2023, US Treasury officials had consistently highlighted Russia's exploitation of African gold resources, including Sudan's, as funding Wagner operations in both Africa and Ukraine. Now, we say prior to 2023 because starting that April, things in Sudan suddenly became a lot more complicated. That was the moment that Africa's third largest country collapsed into an apocalyptic civil war, a war that Moscow has had its hand in. Initially, Wagner backed the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, which had long controlled many of Sudan's gold mines, but the Kremlin took a divergent path, increasingly siding with the rival Sudanese armed forces, eventually even chasing a Port Sudan naval base and formal defense ties. This led to Russian-linked forces essentially playing both sides of a civil war where hundreds of thousands have died, all while extracting as much gold as possible. Since Prigozhin's death and Wagner's transition into the Africa Corps, they've attempted to move toward a more unified position behind the government in Khartoum. But resource extraction still continues unabated. As for what happens with these resources, well, the laundering process follows a well-established pattern. Gold leaves Africa on chartered flights labeled as artisanal or scrap gold to avoid scrutiny. It lands in Dubai, which imported $31 billion in African gold in 2022 alone, much from conflict zones with zero documentation. The UAE's deliberately weak due diligence makes it the perfect laundering hub. Once in Dubai, refineries melt it down and recast it with their own stamps, erasing the trail. The gold often gets re-exported to Switzerland for further refining, then enters London and Zurich markets with clean paperwork. By the time it has Swiss refinery stamps, it's essentially legitimate. The money made from this trade then moves through third-country intermediaries, UAE firms, Turkish banks, Hong Kong traders. The US Treasury has sanctioned multiple companies for converting these gold payments into currency and cryptocurrency for Russian entities. Through this maze of conversions, money eventually reaches Russian military contractors. The Treasury's Africa Gold Advisory explicitly links this pipeline to Wagner's operations, African gold funding Russian military activities through exactly these channels. Russia uses this laundered money for specific military needs. Chinese dual-use electronics for missile systems, Iranian Shahed drones at roughly $20,000 each, North Korean artillery shells, over 2 million rounds delivered so far. They buy smuggled Western microchips through third countries, pay salaries for Wagner and Africa Corps fighters, and fund the operational costs of sanctions evasion networks worldwide. But gold is just one revenue stream. Russia's diamond giant, Alrosa, has expanded operations in Angola and created a Zimbabwe joint venture before sanctions hit, though by late 2024, they'd sold their Angola stake to an Omani company. Russia operates major bauxite assets in Guinea, CBK, Kindia, Dian, adding to the nearly 16 million tons that Moscow extracted in 2024 alone. Wagner received logging concessions in CAR's forests, with CBS News documenting convoys of precious hardwoods crossing into Cameroon with safe passage documents that functioned like diplomatic immunity to avoid inspection. Given all this is so widely known that even YouTubers like us are covering it, you might be wondering something along the lines of, why isn't anyone doing anything to stop this? And the answer is that they're trying. The Office of Foreign Assets Control has sanctioned dozens of companies in this network, including Diamville for diamond operations in CAR and UAE-based Industrial Resources General Trading for facilitating illicit gold financing. But it's not enough. The trade continues through new shell companies that pop up faster than sanctions can target them. And that's bad news. Not just for the West, which is forced to sit back impotently as Moscow makes a mockery of their sanctions, not just for the Ukrainians living in cities bombarded by weapons purchased with these funds, but also for the African civilians who happen to get in the way of this resource extraction machine. In March 2022, for example, during operations to secure gold mining areas in Mali, Wagner forces and Malian troops executed over 500 civilians in the town of Moura. UN investigators and Human Rights Watch documented the massacre. Survivors described Russian-speaking fighters systematically executing men who'd gathered for a weekly market. Countless local miners have been displaced, entire communities terrorized. The gold that local families mined for generations now flows from African soil into Putin's pockets. This brutal extraction system creates the very incentives that ensure its continuation. Every successful resource grab funds more operations. Every protected regime becomes independent on Russian support. Every dollar of laundered gold strengthens the networks that make the next extraction easier. The question is, why do African leaders keep signing up for a security service run by armed bandits? When rebels are advancing on your capital, you don't have time for a multi-year Western capacity-building program. Look at the Central African Republic in January 2021. Rebels fought their way inside the capital, Bangui. Wagner didn't hesitate. They fought alongside a coalition of UN peacekeepers and Rwandans who together stopped the rebel advance, saved Touadera's government, and earned themselves expanded mining concessions. For a leader facing immediate extinction, the choice is obvious. You take the mercenaries who will fight today, not the governance advisors who might help in 10 years. This is the security vacuum Russia exploited across the Sahel. Take Niger's junta. They kicked out 1,500 French troops in 2023 after a decade of Operation Barkhane that spent billions, yet saw the security situation steadily deteriorate. The French had superior military equipment and training, but operated under strict rules of engagement that oftentimes prevented them from directly confronting threats to the regime. Wagner, now the Africa Corps, operates under no such constraints. They'll shoot whoever the junta tells them to, with little concern about human rights or civilian casualties. Yet, for all people may like to talk about how hard times require hard men, the truth is that the hard cases of Wagner haven't done much to improve the lot of the countries they're operating in. If anything, they've turned the already hard times into times of unrelenting misery. Since Wagner got involved in the Sahel, violence has increased. Mali's the poster child for the phenomenon. More civilians died in 2022 than the previous year under French protection. But for the juntas, regime protection, that's all that matters. And with the general still breathing, that is the only metric that they care about. But Africa's response to the system is far from uniform. The continent is split into 3 camps, beginning with the client states who have gone all in with Russia. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the alliance of Sahel states, have essentially become Russian dependencies. The Central African Republic has Russian advisors embedded throughout government ministries. Sudan's warring generals both court Russian support, while Russian paramilitary forces exploit the chaos to extract gold. Libya's Haftar depends heavily on Russian military backing. These countries share common features: recent instability, departed Western forces, and extractable resources that can pay for protection. Then there are the countries that want nothing to do with this. Kenya delivered perhaps the most powerful condemnation of Russia's invasion, calling it out as exactly the kind of colonial aggression the continent has fought to escape. Ghana, Botswana, Namibia are all stable enough so as not to need foreign intervention and can afford to join Kenya in its condemnation. 28 African countries condemned the invasion at the UN, but condemnation from Nairobi or Accra doesn't stop gold flowing out of Mali or CAR. And finally, there are the hedges, the countries that play all sides. South Africa uses BRICS membership to engage Russia while maintaining Western trade ties. Egypt takes Russian weapons and nuclear reactors while receiving $1.3 billion annually in US military aid. Algeria buys Russian weapons but sells gas to Europe. These countries aren't choosing sides, they're maximizing options. China adds its final lock to this system. With $282 billion in trade versus Russia's $20 billion, China dominates Africa's economic landscape. Beijing has invested nearly $200 billion in Belt and Road projects, created over 1 million jobs, and built 6,000 kilometers of railways. But China won't provide regime security through mercenaries. That's too messy for their global image. And this creates a perfect trap. China provides the economic infrastructure that needs stability, along with a healthy dose of debt-enforced blackmail, while Russia provides the stability itself in a messier form that protects Chinese investments, and together they create an extraction system that neither Western development aid nor African resistance can break. The West can't match China's economic scale or Russia's willingness to kill. African states can't refuse Chinese money or Russian guns. The system is essentially locked in. So, what would it take to shut this down? Well, the problem is that every player who could theoretically intervene has calculated that it's just not worth the cost. The UAE processes something in the vicinity of $30 billion in African gold annually through its markets. Turkey, which has shown a willingness to flex its muscles in some international conflict, particularly in Syria, maintains extensive trade relationships with Russia that matter far more to Ankara than what happens in some gold mine in Mali. Beijing's perfectly content to let Russia handle the messy security work while Chinese companies build the infrastructure. In short, every potential disruptor profits too much from the status quo to actually disrupt it. African resources funding foreign wars isn't anything new. It's happened throughout much of the last several centuries. But what makes Russia's approach here so effective is that many African leaders genuinely don't seem to see it as colonialism. When Mali's junta expelled French forces, they celebrated it as finally achieving true independence. The fact that they immediately invited Russian mercenaries wasn't seen as trading one foreign power for another, that the nation's gold is now being extracted and shipped out to Europe by men who don't care if the average Malian lives or dies, apparently isn't ringing any alarm bells. Right now, gold seized from Mali's Interhaka mine is probably being refined in Dubai, or maybe it's already been sold, the proceeds winding through shell companies toward Russia, where it will buy drone components or artillery. The wealth of some of the world's poorest communities converted into weapons for a war uncountable thousands of kilometers away. The uncomfortable truth is that this system works too well to stop. Russia gets away with calling itself anti-colonial while running an extraction operation because it's recycling Soviet propaganda from an era when Moscow controlled half of Europe through puppet governments. The same empire that crushed rebellions from Budapest to Prague now lectures about Western imperialism. But positioning themselves as the anti-Western alternative for Africa provides surprisingly effective cover. So what's this mean going forward? Well, first, Russia has essentially created a sustainable war financing mechanism outside the sanctions regime. As long as African gold keeps flowing through Dubai, Russia can keep buying drones, shells, and chips. This pipeline could theoretically sustain low-intensity operations indefinitely, even if other revenue sources dry up. Second, this model is replicating itself throughout the continent despite its failures. Even though violence in Mali has worsened under Wagner protection, Niger's junta still invited them in. Burkina Faso is flirting with similar such arrangements, albeit on a more limited scale at the time of writing. Other unstable governments with extractable wealth are watching and making their own calculations about whether Russian mercenaries are worth the price. The template exists, and some regimes like what they say. Third, we're watching something akin to a ticking time bomb. These client states, Mali, CAR, Niger, are surviving on Russian military life support while their institutions decay and their economies are stripped. When they eventually collapse, the chaos risks being spectacular. One needs only to look at the civil war raging in Sudan for a preview of that. And when that happens, Russia will simply move on to the next failing state, leaving ruins behind. Perhaps most disturbing is what this reveals about the global order. When mercenary protection looks more attractive than democratic assistance, when extraction companies offer better deals than development banks, when warlords with Russian backing outlast elected governments, we're seeing the rules-based international order lose to raw power and immediate cash. This isn't a bug in the system, it's the system working exactly as its incentives dictate. Until those incentives change, until there are genuine alternatives that address both immediate security needs and long-term development, this pipeline will persist. Russian planes will keep leaving African airstrips loaded with gold. That gold will keep flowing through Dubai into Russian war coffers, and African resources will keep funding European wars as if the great age of empires never really ended. Thank you for watching.